In this episode, we talk about some sensitive topics. You may want to grab some headphones. Think about when you were growing up, all the questions and doubts and maybe even awkward insecurities you had when it came to sex and sexuality. Maybe you had an awkward transition through puberty. I mean, haven't we all? Maybe you had an embarrassing moment with a partner, your first crush, your first kiss. Maybe you had questions about your body or dating or being intimate with a partner. Now think about how you worked through those moments, through those questions. Most people, at best, just stumble through, carrying a scar of the memory. At worst, they may spend years of their lives without a clue how to address those questions, how to even express themselves. If you were really lucky, you may have had someone you could ask those embarrassing questions to. Here's a question for you. How did your parents approach this conversation with you? Or did they? How do you want to approach this conversation with your kids? If you're someone who's trying to be more present, more intentional, more open as a parent or aunt or teacher or uncle, role model, then this episode is for you. Welcome to the XO Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Rishma Walji. This is the podcast for growth-oriented people who are trying to make conscious, intentional decisions about how they show up in the world, for their relationships, and with themselves. It's too easy to get caught up in the momentum of life, in societal pressures and our own fears and insecurities. On this show, we talk about how to pay attention and how to make meaningful changes in our lives so that we can go beyond an ordinary day and into an extraordinary XO life, whatever that looks like for you. Today, we're talking about having uncomfortable conversations with your kids when it comes to gender and sexuality, how to do it, how to make it smoother, and how to maintain a safe space for your family while they're going through those same awkward struggles that we've all been through.
My name is Allison, and I'm bisexual. I think I've always known that, but I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so it really was not as accepted, certainly, as it is today. And I think being bisexual, you have the out of always being heterosexual appearing. In my early 20s, I would say I was out. I was living away from my family. I was dating different people, but ultimately I met my husband and fell in love, and we got married and did all that. And so I've been heterosexual appearing for like most of my adult life. And, it's not something you just bring up. You just live with it, I guess.
And then did you never end up telling your family, your parents?
My parents, no.
And to this day, your parents don't know?
No, they don't. They're just very old school. We know for a fact that my stepmother has a cousin who is gay, and they don't even see it. And it's so obvious. I mean, he lives with a man. Like, it's so obvious. But they're just very head in the sand. And I don't think they would disown me. I don't think that would have happened, but it just never seemed worth it to tell them just because of their attitude, and they wouldn't really understand it. And I didn't want to almost waste my time explaining it to them.
If you didn't talk to her, you would never know that she was bisexual. I mean, not that it's anyone's business, but it is part of her identity. It's part of who she is. So eventually, Allison felt the need to come out, not to her parents, but to her kids.
Probably 3 or 4 years ago, I kind of felt like I was living a bit of a lie. So I got more active, certainly online, in online community. And I decided it was important to come out to my kids because I want to be open with them, and I want them to always feel comfortable coming to me and my husband about things. So probably when my son was 13 and my daughter was 9, I told my son first. His first question was, does dad know? And I said, yes. And his second question was, is dad? And I said, no. We were in the car. We had just walked the dog. And he was like, okay, that's fine. That was kind of his attitude. My daughter, I told her, and she was so sweet and so supportive. She hugged me. She told me that she loved me and it didn't really matter. She is very accepting of everything.
How do you feel now that you've come out and you've talked to your family about it?
I feel good. It's like, it's part of me and it's not something I should hide. We brought the kids up to always be accepting of everybody, no matter what. Religion, color, sexuality, like you have to be kind. That's the first lesson we have with the kids. And none of that affects you. So you don't have a say in what people say or do. And you judge people on, their character, not who they want to be in a relationship with or the color of their skin or anything else. So my kids have been brought up with that from day one.
If you're a parent, you know how hard it is to manage not just the chores and the to-do list, let alone all the emotions that come up on a day-to-day basis, not just our kids' emotions, but our own too. And as a parent, I think it matters now more than ever to be someone who our kids can come to, whatever personality or style you have, however you show up, as long as we do show up. And that's why today I'm talking to someone about how to have conversations with our kids about sex. It's actually a topic that people have messaged me about a number of times. So here you go. Today I'm talking to Dr. Ashifa Jiwa. She's a physician with a focus in trans care and sexual and mental health. She also teaches sex ed at the elementary school where her 2 kids go. I also know her personally, and she is just so knowledgeable and caring and articulate that I couldn't wait to have this conversation with her. She has incredible expertise, and she also has an interest in making sure important conversations are happening, which is an interest we both share.
Hi, I'm Ashifa, and probably one of my favorite things to do is going for a hike with my dog and my kids.
One of the conversations that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is the one around sex.
I think absolutely that's true. And I find it concerning because it is such a big part of the human experience. And it's something that is on the minds of kids younger and younger because of their access to media and the internet and even, references in songs and movies.
They want to know this information, and we want them to get the information from a reliable source rather than from somewhere online. And while sometimes the topic will come up at school, it's typically not something that's discussed often or even openly. I mean, we're not even talking about periods or waxing or shaving during regular conversation, let alone intimacy and sexuality. That said, I think there is more conversation generally than when I was younger, but the conversation in the home is still really important.
Yes, I agree. And I think that where their brain is at in grade 7 and 8 is very different from where their brain is at in grade 10 and 11. And some repetition of that information and putting it in a more contextual framework for where they're at, it may be received in a different way.
How do kids ask these questions? And how do parents stay involved in the conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said, how do kids ask? And I think creating an environment where it's okay to ask and where there's transparency in the relationship you have with your kids and where there's a lack of judgment when they do ask certain questions is incredibly important because it will foster the type of relationship that will make it easy for them to ask the hard questions. So I think this starts very young when toddlers are curious about body parts, using proper terminology and being very matter of fact about it.
So for example, rather than saying down there or your wiener or hoo-hoo, you could say the terms vulva, vagina, penis, scrotum.
You might feel your own discomfort, but to not show it to your child in ways that make it seem like this topic is more loaded than any other topic. You know, they'll ask you about nutrition, and they'll ask you about violence, and they'll ask you about video games and about emotional interactions with friends. And none of that feels quite as loaded to most of us as talking about sexuality or even private, quote unquote, parts of our body. So I think destigmatizing it in the way we talk about it. So normalizing it, making it a normal part of conversation, using proper terminology, just making it normal really is going to create an environment where your kids feel comfortable talking about it with you, and doing that from a very young age. Now, when they get a bit older, it gets a little tougher, right? The questions are more uncomfortable. But I think that if we continue on that thread of normalizing it and not making it a loaded topic, and just really using plain language upfront, even sharing a little bit of your stories from when you were younger, letting yourself be vulnerable will allow your children to be vulnerable with you as well.
How do you stay open and also not project your own thoughts, fears, and experiences onto your conversation with your kids? Because there's a balance, I think, where we want to protect our kids and help them be safe, but we also want to be able to let them go out into the world and live and experience their own lives.
Yeah, so I think general concepts of safety in this context really are universal, right? We're talking about consent and setting boundaries with your body and being okay to say no, and hearing when someone says no, either with their words or their body language, is really, really important. And this is a bit of a gendered statement, but I think on the whole, sexual violence against women is much more prevalent, or at least spoken about, than sexual violence against men. And I'm using the terms male and female broadly to mean cis men and women. But I think that parents of female children spend a lot of time worrying about their safety and spend a lot of time talking to them about how to keep safe. And I would love to see it where parents of male children are doing the same about how to be safe and how to make people feel respected and how to make people feel safe and how to listen for consent that's not always explicitly said, and how to read body language.
This is such a good point, because we often do talk about safety for ourselves, but we less often talk about safety for others and safety in relationships. As an aside, if you're interested in more information about safety online, I did a great interview with someone about protecting your mental wellness online. It's from season 2 with Dr. Dawn Grant. So you can go back and listen to that. And there's also an episode separately about social media. Something that I want to make sure I mention is that talking to kids about sex isn't just about safety or personal hygiene. I think those are the things that are focused on mostly, and definitely they're important. But I think as parents, we, of course, want to emphasize this part of hygiene and safety. But as a healthcare provider, and also with my years of work in the fertility world, I want to mention that it's important to discuss intimacy and sex in a way that isn't just about safety and protection, but also about pleasure. Of course, we want to take age into consideration. There's emotional maturity of the child, and it might be controversial, but I have girls and they won't necessarily discover pleasure on their own. And I think it's important for them to know that they can feel pleasure and that they should understand their bodies enough to know what is pleasurable for them, and that you don't need to rely on someone else to give them pleasure. And I feel really strongly about this because intimacy can be very emotional. And it's also such a big part of relationships and connections between partners, but there can also be a power dynamic.
I think this is amazing, Rishma. I think it's so great that you brought this up. I do think that is such an important thing to acknowledge for a few reasons. One is because many, many cultures over many, many generations have had a veil of secrecy and shame around sex, and particularly around women's pleasure in sex and sexual activity. It's quite taboo to talk about female pleasure in sex. So I think it's a very balanced and real way to approach it, right? And it also allows all people, regardless of gender, to know that they're deserving of pleasure in those settings, that it's not just about one person getting the pleasure and the other person giving the pleasure. I also think it's important because kids are going to figure it out themselves. And if you haven't talked to them about it, they're not going to trust you as much. You know, they're going to say, oh yeah, mom talked to her, dad talked to me about this. And they talked about all the negative things, but they never talked about how amazing it is. Maybe they don't know. Maybe they've never experienced this level of pleasure. And I know something they don't, which is such a typical teenage thing to think, right? You know, I have 2 boys, and maybe it's easier with boys because boys are always, as young toddlers, touching their genitals. So you have a lot of opportunity at a young age to say, you know, that can feel really good and there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's really a nice thing, but it's something that's not okay to do in front of other people. Certainly that is something I've talked about with my kids. You know, we've talked about the procreative role of sex, but also the pleasure role of sex. And, you know, I almost have to talk about it in terms of it not being about procreation because my kids have 2 moms. So they know that that procreation doesn't come from that. So I think it's important because it also makes the conversation around sex more inclusive, to include all types of relationships that don't strive to create babies. Like sex is not just about that. And any kind of relationship that is either same sex or, you know, between people who are infertile or people who are trans and the different body parts that exist don't lead to pregnancy, or people who choose not to have kids and are on birth control. I mean, how can you have a conversation about birth control if you're not talking about sex outside of the context of having kids, right? So I think the conversation around pleasure is really important, both around empowering women to seek it and letting kids know that this is an important piece of it.
In season 2, I did an episode called Behind Closed Doors. If you haven't listened, go back and listen to it after you're done with this episode. I shared a story of a woman who wasn't taught any of this, and it impacted her life and her relationship very profoundly. And her experience is more common than you'd ever realize. So this is something that I want to talk to my kids about. But they're still at an age where we're just starting to navigate that. And I know a lot of parents think I'm completely strange for saying it, but I'm on a mission to make sure that they know what they need to know in life. I'm including some references and links in the show notes if anyone is interested in learning more. Of course, it's not comprehensive, but it's definitely a good place to start. I asked Ashifa what other things she thinks would be helpful for people who might feel some discomfort with these topics, and her response was so wonderfully unexpected.
I'm genuinely curious because I think I have a bit of a privilege here and an advantage that I don't feel that discomfort around talking about this. So I'm curious. I would love to know what the discomfort is.
I love that she asked this. I love that she's in a place where conversations about sexuality are as normal as talking about the weather. I remember when my younger daughter was learning about some of these topics in health class, I asked to talk to her about it and bring it up and see if she had any questions. And at first, she was embarrassed. She avoided the conversation. And then my older daughter, who was sitting in the next room, it's an open concept sort of space, she overheard us and she looks up from her computer and she calls out, "Just get used to it." I guess I've brought up conversations about our bodies and our periods and sex so many times in our house that it's become more natural for all of us. I think we can all keep trying. So to answer Ashifa's question, I told her that, for example, dads have asked me how to talk about periods with their daughters. Moms have asked me how to talk to their boys about when they touch their genitals. A few parents have mentioned feeling unsure about their child who is non-binary and not knowing how to support their child, or not just with their own journey, but also navigating a world where sometimes people aren't very kind. I've gotten so many questions over the years, and I try to answer them as best I can, but I wanted to get Ashifa's perspective given her expertise.
I think dealing with trying to examine what's uncomfortable about it for you first is really important, because kids who are teens or preteens, they have really good bullshit detectors. So if you're pretending to be comfortable and you're not, they're going to know. So I would say, try to examine why you're uncomfortable. What about this is uncomfortable? Is it, as you mentioned earlier, the messages you grew up with? And how do you feel about those messages? Are they valid? Are they still relevant? Do you wish they had been different? Or are you happy with the messaging you got?
That's a really good point and a great way to think about it. What is it about this conversation that makes it a big deal? And how can we start making it just as easy to talk about as anything else? You can't ever be perfect. And this is sort of like any message. You just have to try and be open and honest. We can't always get it right. But getting it right isn't really the point, is it?
So, for example, when I teach sex ed, I don't split the genders up. We all talk about periods, and we all talk about pads, and we all talk about tampons. And that did not happen when I went to school. But I think it's really important how we talk about it when we're not talking about it is really important. Kids are watching when we think they're not, right? And that's when they're picking up our messages. So how we talk about our bodies, how we talk about our body functions, even our gendered bodied functions, how we talk about our relationships, how they see us have conflict and repair conflict, how they see us respecting boundaries of them as well as other people. Those things are very, very meaningful. So yes, the nuts and bolts and the practicality of how do you talk to your daughter about their period when you're a male parent is super important. And I think, how you talk about everything else all the other time impacts it. Asking yourself, what about this is different than brushing your teeth? It's a hygiene issue. Or if you're a male parent, you may not have ever had long hair that needed long hair care and braiding, but you're still going to be comfortable helping your daughter manage her hair hygiene. Certainly there would be times when you would brush out your daughter's hair and braid it or put some conditioner in it to get the tangles out, and none of that would feel loaded. So similarly, the same way that you learned how to do those things are the same ways that you can learn how to approach talking about a period. You have to neutralize it. You have to make it as neutral as that. It's a hygiene issue. It is a hygiene issue that is specific to people with uteruses. So if you don't have a uterus, it's difficult, but it doesn't need to be more difficult than long hair if you have short hair.
Let's also, just for clarity's sake, differentiate some of the big terms and concepts that can be points of discussion. And the very first one I want to mention is that gender identity and sexual orientation are two very different things.
So sexual orientation relates to who you're attracted to. So you could be attracted to people of the same sex, people of the opposite sex, people of both sexes, or you could be attracted to all genders. And then gender identity is largely related to how you see yourself. So it's a very internal thing. It's about your relationship with yourself. So do you see yourself as male, as female, as non-binary, meaning somewhere in between the two? So there's a real understanding amongst the new generation that gender is not as binary as we thought. So there's this newer concept, and I don't think it is new, but I think it's new language, right? The concept has been around probably for millennia, to be honest. I mean, First Nations people have always had two-spirited people, and they have been very highly respected in their communities, who are thought to have both male and female spirits within them. And certainly many cultures have had trans people either closeted or open in a certain societal role, right, for thousands of years. So none of this is new. What's new is the language we're developing and the comfort we're having normalizing and talking about it. And that part is new. And so kids are sort of thinking about themselves in these terms where they don't need to necessarily just accept that the gender they were assigned at birth needs to be the way they walk through the world. And gender is a social construct. It's how we walk through the world. And it impacts a lot. It impacts how people treat us. It impacts how we dress and how we walk and how we move and how we do our hair and how we present ourselves to the world. In fact, there certainly are many people who internally are trans. They don't match the gender they were assigned at birth, but they don't express it. And they make that choice strategically or out of necessity for safety. And they continue to express their gender as their assigned gender, but they're trans internally. So you can't assume someone's gender by looking at them. And sometimes gender identity or gender expression can be very fluid as well. So it's not always fixed. It's confusing for a lot of people of our generation who have not had a lot of contact with it. And it's hard to wrap your head around. And it's okay that it's hard to wrap your head around. I think sometimes we can feel shame or overwhelm when something feels really hard to wrap our head around. It seems like our kids are a bit ahead of us on it. And then it shuts down conversation or it shuts down our learning because it's not a comfortable feeling to feel behind the eight ball. And like, just to put it in context, everyone gets it wrong, right? And everyone gets the terminology wrong. Even I do. And there's terms I don't know, and I work in this field. So it's not about being perfect or knowing everything. It's just about approaching it in the same non-loaded way that you would approach anything else.
What age is it appropriate for kids to start seeing a healthcare provider or seeking some sort of medical intervention?
It's a good question. So I think it's a really nuanced answer. So I think the first thing is really to explore this with the child, right? To explore where they're at and how long they've been feeling this way. But gender dysphoria, the medical definition of it is intense discomfort with one's own gender or a desire to have characteristics of a different gender for at least 6 months, lasting at least 6 months. So that's sort of the time frame that one looks at to make the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Now, just because you have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, it doesn't mean that physical transition is the right thing or at the right time. It may be. And for some kids, it's really life-saving. And for other kids, it is just something they need to acknowledge and be heard and validated for. So what you do once you recognize that there's gender dysphoria is not cookie cutter as well. It really depends on your knowledge of your kid's knowledge of yourself, how much soul searching they've done, how much exploration, and also their level of ability to comprehend long-term effects of any interventions. A lot of people choose to kind of socially transition first. Other people feel very unsafe socially transitioning until they have physical characteristics to match. So a lot of it is about navigating it as a conversation with your child, just like you would any other conversation around anything they're wanting to explore, and really listening to their fears and to their needs. I've had patients who have come in and said, my child has been socially transitioned since they were 6. Like this has not changed. This is very persistent. From the age of 6, they have known that they are not their assigned gender, and it's really clear to us. And their body's changing with puberty. It's causing huge distress. There's suicidality. There's withdrawing. They're not going to school. In situations like that, it's really clear. Most situations are somewhere in between, really clear and not, and sort of really early exploration. So in most cases, it's about trying to stop any further pubertal changes first. So that can be done anytime after the age of 12, once people have entered puberty. Now that maybe is a little late for some because some people enter puberty earlier, but really you need to have started puberty before any medical intervention happens. So the first step is just to block puberty. So there are medications that just stop puberty. They're fully reversible. There's nothing permanent about them for the most part. They're relatively safe, and they just press pause so that kids have time to sort out what's going on in their mind without the roller coaster of puberty, without the roller coaster of their body changing so rapidly and feeling like there's a time crunch to make this decision.
I think one of the concerns that parents tend to have is that in some cases it might be unclear when their child is young. So how does one differentiate, let's say, curiosity? And I know there's a huge spectrum, of course, but how do you suggest someone approaches that conversation?
Yeah, I think it is difficult, right? It's difficult because because I even see fluidity in my patients sometimes, right? So, and sometimes people need to go through some stages of seeking help and seeking out peer groups or even talking to a doctor to recognize that things aren't as clear as they thought. What I would say is this. So think back to when you were a teenager or even now, right? We all have sort of parts of us that still act like teenagers. So if someone doesn't believe you or doesn't value your opinion, we all generally dig our heels in a little bit deeper, right? So when we're not heard, when we are invalidated, when we're not trusted, our tendency isn't to sort of reflect and think, was I wrong? Our knee-jerk tendency tends to be, how dare they not listen to me? I know what I'm talking about. And you dig your heels in and you get a bit stronger in your stance and triple that or multiply it by 10 for a teenager, right? That's sort of their nature. They're starting to differentiate from you, and anything that pulls them back, they're going to dig their heels in. So if you're concerned that they haven't thought it through, your best thing is to support them and to listen to them rather than talking to them. Like, listening is very, very powerful, non-judgmental listening. And actually hearing what they say. And in that, and in your acceptance, it will take away that need to dig in heels. And it will make it also a lot easier for them to sort out what's really coming from within. So I'd say certainly don't be scared that validation is going to reduce critical thought within themselves. I think it will increase it. The second piece I'd say is that I work with a lot of trans kids, and they're some of the most insightful people I've ever met. Life has not come easy for them. They have never felt comfortable in their bodies. It's different for each person, but many of them have had many years of feeling internal dysphoria before they ever talk to you about it. It has to be pretty severe for them to talk to you about it. So be aware that this has probably been going on under the surface a lot longer. They have probably done a lot more internal work than you realize, and acknowledge that, right? And value it, because that is, trans kids tend to be much more, in my experience, self-aware and insightful than most kids, because they have had to. They have had to think about things that the rest of us have not had to think about.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes in the midst of our own thoughts and emotions, it's not easy to stay calm and open to listening. But we need to remember that our kids are also having their own thoughts and feelings at the same time.
Yeah, and it's advice that's easy to give and hard to take. Myself too, right? As my oldest approaches teenagehood, I find myself not always doing that. But someone said to me recently, and I really like this, and I keep this in the back of my mind, is that puberty and teenage life is basically a roller coaster. Right? They are on a roller coaster. Their body's changing. Their emotions are flipping back and forth so rapidly. There's drama with friends. Our job is to not get on the roller coaster. Our job is to be there as they're on the roller coaster and ground them. And if we let ourselves get on the roller coaster, it's much harder to do our job as parents. So I find that a really helpful guiding principle. That doesn't mean don't listen to your kid when they have fluidity in their gender or sexuality. The roller coaster is the big emotions that come with it and the big rebellious feelings that come with being invalidated.
We've all heard of situations where someone talks to their family and that conversation goes badly. I want to share a story of what happens when the conversation goes well.
My story was definitely a little bit different than I feel like a lot of people's stories. When I came out to my parents, I had just gone out with a girl that turned it into a date. And I remember coming home and it was like midnight and I was sitting on the stairs in the dark and I was waiting for my dad. And he came out of the bathroom and I kind of scared him actually. And he was like, "Oh, hi, what are you doing here?" And I said to him, I was like, so I'm dating girls now. And he's like, "Okay, cool." And I'm like, "That's it?" And he's like, "Yeah, are you happy?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm happy." And he's like, "Okay, great. Then I'm happy." Because realistically, I'm like, whatever I want is not going to change what you're interested in. But how I react is going to change how our relationship is going to be. I'm going to love you regardless.
I love this. Did your dad actually say all of those words to you?
Yeah. For me, that was a very interesting perspective because they took it as if I told them I was dating a guy. And this happened with my entire family. When I told my parents, both of them, when I told my grandparents, very religious, Ismaili, Muslim grandparents, they did not bat an eye. They all took it like I told them the most normal thing in the world. And for me, that was like, wow, this is not weird. This is not different. This made me feel like a normal human being. Like I was just normally going through love like everyone else.
So happy for you that you've had that experience.
Yeah, it's definitely something I feel very blessed for.
Thank you so much for joining me. Please share this episode with someone who might need to hear it. And always feel free to reach out at hello@livingxo.com. I love hearing from you. Let me know what topics you want me to cover, what aha moments you had, anything that resonated with you. It would mean a lot to hear from you. hello@livingxo.com. And don't forget, you can always find my free resources on the website, livingxo.com.